back to my channel. In today's video, I wanted to talk to you about a National Autistic Society mental health conference that I attended online last Thursday. It was an online conference, so it's attended virtually via video. And the reason I attended was because I attend an autism self-advocacy group, and I was invited to attend by the people who sort of organised the self-advocacy group. They funded me and one other person from the group to attend, because two people from the group were funded to attend, and I wanted to attend, and there's one other person, so we were both funded to attend, so I didn't have to pay for it or anything. Yeah, it was basically a whole day of talks and things, but you can watch them afterwards as well on demand, which I have done. I've seen some of them again, and they're on demand for people who've attended the conference for up to a month, I think, as well as some other content that wasn't live that you could also access for a month. So I just wanted to kind of like talk you through what happened, the sort of main sort of things that were talked about, so you could get a sort of a sort of flavour of what I experienced. So the first talk at the So first of all, we had an introduction from the chairs. The two chairs were Catriona Stewart, who's Scottish, and she set up SWAN, which I think is Scottish Women's, I can't remember what it stands for now, Scottish Women's Autism something, some organisation set up, but she set up the acronym SWAN. I can't actually remember what it stands for, but it's an autistic women's organisation. I'm not sure if she's autistic herself. I'm not sure, she might be. I'm not sure actually. But yeah, so she was one of the chairs, and also there was one other chair. What was his name? I wrote it down. Tom Purser was the other chair, who's worked for the National Autistic Society for 11 years. He's head of guidance, volunteering and campaigns, and he's got an autistic son. Dr. Catriona Stewart, the other chair, is an OBE and founder of Scottish Autism Women's Network. That's what it's called, SWAN. She's the ambassador to the Scottish Government on improving autism education and awareness. So they were the chairs. They introduced it, and Catriona is passionate about autistic girls getting out of school and into adulthood with their mental health intact. And she recently received emergency funding from the Scottish Government to a community welfare fund. And with that money, she's commissioned one-to-one counselling services for autistic women who have been under pressure during COVID, and the services are actually delivered by autistic professional counsellors. So autistic professional counsellors deliver the training to autistic women, and apparently she's had positive feedback from that people who use the service love working with someone who gets them and they don't have to explain themselves to that person. Now, interestingly, from a personal perspective, and I don't know about any autistics watching this, and you might completely disagree with me, that's completely fine, but it's just a personal thing. From my own personal perspective, I wouldn't want to receive counselling from an autistic person, because I sort of feel it's a bit like blind leading a blind. And also, I kind of quite like the distance, objective distance. If I were to go for counselling, I'd actually want the person to be non-autistic, just because it doesn't actually alleviate my social difficulties speaking to an autistic person. It sometimes actually compounds them, because I can kind of sense that the other person also has social difficulties. So for me, I actually personally prefer it if the person is non-autistic, because I just feel that they're better able to socially navigate things, and that makes things easier for me, like relieves the burden. And also, I'm quite a competitive person, so I sometimes feel a little bit like resentful that like they're higher up than me and they're autistic too, and that annoys me because I have self-esteem issues about the fact I haven't achieved much or achieved in inverted commas as an autistic person, and I compare myself a lot to more so-called more successful autistics. So that would kind of bring up some rather negative feelings. So I actually prefer it if I were to go to counselling or like receive any help from someone that don't have the same diagnosis as me, because actually I find it a bit threatening. Like, I go to autistic people for advice, like in my peer support groups, and that's different because we're on a level playing field. But it's a bit like having another autistic person, same diagnosis, who's like above you. I mean, they're not technically above you, you know what I mean? But they're in work, they've got a job, and it just kind of elevates my feeling of inferiority. So I actually prefer having a non-autistic counsellor. And it was the same if I was being educated. I actually prefer it if they weren't autistic. It just brings up negative feelings. Possibly if I was a teenager, it'd be different, but now, yeah, that's just me. That's just my personal thing. And I don't know if I'm the only one, and I don't know whether some other people might experience this, or whether other people with other disabilities or conditions might sometimes not like having someone with the same condition, like helping them in that way. They might feel a little bit like, I don't know, uncomfortable. But let me know what you think. But interestingly, clearly lots of people like this. So obviously, there's a massive difference of opinion. But I just wanted to air that. Obviously, I'm autistic and I have the opposite experience with this, and probably get other people like me. So I just wanted to express that. So now on to the presentations that were talked about. Sorry, the presenters and what they talked about. So first of all, we had Sarah McCulloch, might not be pronouncing her name correctly, Sarah McCulloch, who's an autistic occupational therapist, interestingly enough, and she's also the deputy manager of a community mental health team. It's quite high up. And she was talking about the challenges that autistic people face who have mental health problems entering a community mental health team. None of these problems are news to me, like they're kind of fairly self-obvious, but obviously, for someone who's actually been through that, but obviously for some people, maybe they don't know about these things and need educating. So she talked about some challenges. The first challenge is obviously that autistic people are much more likely to need mental health services in the first place. Because they often have co-occurring conditions, for example, depression, anxiety, burnout, things like that. Burnout, which is different to depression, is conceptualised as resulting from chronic life stress and a mismatch of expectations and abilities without adequate supports, and it causes long-term exhaustion, loss of function, and reduced tolerance to stimulus. It can present as depression, though, when it's actually burnout, and it can't be treated with antidepressants like depression can, so it can be misunderstood as treatment-resistant depression. Fortunately, I've never experienced burnout, and I've never been depressed either, but then again, my life has been fairly, conforming to my needs. Like, obviously I can't work, I'm not in work, and my disability issues mean I can't work. So I've never really been in a situation that I can't handle, precisely because I've never been put in those situations. When I was at school, I was fairly coddled in a way. Like, my parents did a lot for me, and it was very routinized, which actually I thrived on, even though school was very stressful as well, but like lots of things were taken care of. So I've never been in a situation that has kind of exhausted me to that extent. So I've never had burnout, but I can understand how this could potentially happen if you are in a situation that you can't deal with and you're put under a prolonged period of stress and you're not understood. But I've been very fortunate, I've never experienced that. So again, she talked about challenge number 2. Challenge number 2, autistic people who don't look autistic are not identified or believed, and that's obviously very common. When I say don't look autistic, that's obviously according to some kind of very narrow stereotype about how autistic people are supposed to look, that I would hope is kind of dying a death now, because obviously, there's been a lot of awareness around this, that you can't necessarily detect autism just through how someone appears, at least not superficially. Then she talks about the old idea of the autism spectrum that is now being challenged, the idea of autism as a linear spectrum, where you have high functioning autism at level 1, where you need support, but your social skills and repetitive behaviours are only noticeable without support. And then you have level 2, where you have substantial support and behaviours are still obvious even with support, and then you have so-called severe autism, which is level 3, where you have very substantial support that severely impairs life. That's the idea of the autism as a linear spectrum, and that's kind of what they talk about still in a DSM even today. But this has been questioned because it rests on this idea that autism is one thing and that you can kind of rate autism. in that way, which is questionable. And she says that maybe we should actually think about autism more as a strengths wheel, not a linear idea that you can be less to very autistic as though it's like one condition, but instead as a strengths wheel where people have, some people say struggle more in certain areas, and there's like in all the traits on the wheel, each trait is seen separately. So someone might say have very severe repetitive behaviours or rigid routines, be really severely impacted in that trait, but again they might have comparatively mild social difficulties, or someone might have very severe motor difficulties, for example, but have great language skills, or whatever. Or someone might have severe difficulties in all of those areas, but there could also be people who have not so severe issues in some areas, but then in other areas their issues are really severe, which kind of counterbalances the fact that in other areas their issues might be milder, so they still might have very severe difficulties, even if it's only severe in a couple of domains, for example. So yeah, maybe looking at it more as a strengths wheel, she suggests as not linear. And she also said that HFA and LF are harmful terms. I kind of agree with that on one level. Yes, we should move away from a linear spectrum, really, because, like I say, autism isn't one thing. It's treated as one thing, but I feel that's rather unhelpful. I don't think that's one of the disadvantages of getting rid of subgroups, actually, is that it's very hard now to talk about your struggles without using words that maybe aren't helpful, like HFA and LFA, because it's still talked about as one thing, when actually, scientifically speaking, autism is not one thing. And it doesn't really make any sense to compare opposites like that. It'd be like, say, I don't know, comparing someone with depression to someone with dementia or whatever, and saying that the person with dementia has more severe issues than a depressed person when you're not comparing like with like or whatever. So it's kind of it doesn't really make sense, because they're different. Someone can have autism and be severely impacted without diminishing experience of someone, say, who needs more support from them, because you're not really comparing like with like. So yeah, I can kind of see both sides, but I sort of feel like that moving away from a sort of linear spectrum would make it easier then to kind of talk about, to not trivialise other people's experiences when you're talking about severity. Because so far, if you talk about having severe issues as an autistic person, people often say, well, you're not severely autistic because, you know, you can only be severely autistic if you can't speak or if you need 24/7 care. So it's very difficult to kind of, when actually I feel you can be severely autistic actually and be able to talk and all of those things. And I feel you should be able to say that without diminishing other person's experiences. And I feel that the only way to do that is to have an idea that actually you're not talking about the same type of autism. Someone who can talk doesn't have the same type of autism as someone who can't talk, but can still be severely impacted for different reasons. So I do feel that maybe we should get away from this linear idea, and that will make it easier then. I do feel that. I do feel that people are very differing degrees of disability, however, and I do feel that some people have greater impairments than others, and I do think it's acceptable to talk about that. Maybe it's just that obviously, like, the whole high functioning, low functioning thing obviously can sometimes feel very trivialising for some people, so maybe we just need different language. But I do feel that quite clearly some people are more impacted than others. I just feel we need to find language that we could talk about that without trivialising other people's experiences. Maybe talking about subgroups is one way of doing that. Challenge 3, she said specific autistic needs are under-recognised, and she also said that we need to have an autistic vocabulary so that when people come to services and describe difficulties understanding their own feelings, for example, they can be told that they have alexithymia, or say if they're often getting very overwhelmed and they don't know why, they can be told they're having meltdowns. So to have a kind of an autistic vocabulary there, where people who work in mental health teams are well versed in autistic vocabulary, will then mean that they're better able to recognise autistic needs and help autistic people to advocate for themselves. She said that was very important. I'm going to move over to video number 2 now to carry on talking about this. So moving over to video number 2.